Helena Blavatsky, author of The Secret Doctrine, specifically locates the sacred island of Shambhala in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. Mount Meru, the sacred mountain in Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies, the axis mundi which connects heaven and earth, lies at the centre of Shambhala. It is surrounded by 4 continents. These continents trace out the course of human evolution and are associated with the 4 root races which have preceded ours: Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian and Atlantean, and with the different types of procreation associated with them. Lest there be any misunderstanding along racial lines, when the Kalachakra Tantra and the Secret Doctrine refer to the history of the root races, they are not referring to the racial distinctions that exist on the planet today, or indeed that have existed at any one time in the past. They are referring to the major evolutionary stages which apply to all human beings living on the planet at the same time. The philosopher, social reformer, esotericist and founder of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, said that the term race was not appropriate in the modern world, a wise criticism given the rank injustice that is still perpetrated today because of racial difference. And he called the time periods associated with these races epochs. Blavatsky and the subsequent New Age writers were all keen to stress that their ultimate hope for all human beings, regardless of race, was that they could be united in brotherhood. Race being a somewhat dubious, albeit challenging distinction, given that we have all incarnated in all of the races during the long history of the soul. She said that while there were some Lemurian and Atlantean remnants still on the earth today, most people who were alive during this, the period of the 5th root race, were members of the 5th root race. The 5th root race is called the Aryan race, but it should be noted, as can be seen from the quote below, that the term is used quite differently from how it was used by anthropologists in the 19th and 20th centuries to describe people of Western, Asian and European origin who belonged to the Indo-European language group and represented a subrace of the now anthropologically defunct Caucasian race. It is certainly used in a very different sense to Adolf Hitler and other white supremacists who claimed and still claim that the Aryan race could be identified by Northern European, ideally Nordic, characteristics, and that these characteristics rendered it superior. Instead, Blavatsky writes, the Aryan races, for instance, now varying from dark brown, almost black, red, brown, yellow, down to the whitest creamy colour, are yet all of one and the same stock, the 5th root race, and spring from one single progenitor, which Hindus called Manu. Theosophists believe that each root race has a separate and distinct progenitor. In reality, there is no inferior or low-grade race, because all of it are one common humankind. Our racial and epochal history is long and complex, and too simplistic a treatment of the subject could, for obvious reasons, render it open to dangerous misinterpretation. But the following summary is aimed at explaining the place of this subject within the Kalachakra teaching. According to Blavatsky, there will be 7 root races altogether, 7 great stages of evolution, with each root race divided into 7 sub-races. The 4 humanoid races which are associated with the 4 continents surrounding Mount Meru equate, in Buddhism, with 4 different types of birth or procreation. First, born from transformation or emanation, that is, without wombs, eggs or dampness, like the spontaneous or miraculous materialization of deities, demons and most devas. Secondly, born from moisture and heat, probably like worms or maggots, or like microorganisms or animals whose eggs are microscopic. Thirdly, born from eggs, like birds, fishes or reptiles. And fourthly, born from wombs, like mammals, and some worldly devas. The first root race, the Polarian, was the first evolutionary cycle of humanity on Earth, and could have originated as far back as the Silurian period, which, according to current estimates, occurred 420 to 444 million years ago. It was constituted of ethereal beings that were devoid of physicality and mind. These asexual beings were called the self-born, in that they were emanated, the first type of birth in Buddhism, from the bodies of the Bahishad or lunar pitris, without any sexual activity. The forms that were created were the astral forms or doubles of the pitris, shadows or phantoms, empty shells that became the vehicles for the human monads. Mind was not yet present, and so there was no connection between the inner and outer aspects of these beings. But these sexless ethereal forms provided matter with a basic template upon which to build the evolving human being. The first race did not die as such. Instead, at a certain evolutionary point, the old form was transmuted into the new, more physical form of the second root race. The first root race inhabited the first continent, which was known as the imperishable sacred land. Not much is known about this continent, other than it is located at the North Pole, which would have been much warmer at that extremely remote time, as the Earth was still cooling, and, unlike subsequent continents, is destined never to sink. It is destined instead to endure forever, and has been identified by some as Shambhala itself. According to an ancient commentary, the pole star has its watchful eye upon it, from the dawn to the close of the twilight of a day of the great breath. The second root race, the Hyperborean, emerged from the Polarian around 25 to 30 million years ago. It was less ethereal than the first root race, but the Hyperboreans had not yet acquired full-density physical bodies. They were called sweat-born because they reproduced by budding, by oozing a vital fluid, that is, which formed into an egg-shaped ball that served as an outside vehicle for a fetus. This was the second kind of Buddhist birth or procreation. Hyperborea, the second continent, included what are now the land masses which extend southwards from the North Pole, such as the northern parts of Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Scandinavia, and Russia. At the time of the second root race, the climate had cooled down somewhat, but was still tropical. The third root race, the Lemurian, emerged from the Hyperborean. It had 3 stages, which were characterized by different methods of procreation. First of all, the sweat-born method, which it inherited from the previous race, the Hyperborean. Secondly, the laying of eggs by androgynous humans. And the third stage, approximately halfway through the time of the third root race, when it separated into the 2 sexes and began to reproduce like modern humans. The Lemurians inhabited the third continent, Lemuria, a landmass covering a large part of what is now the Indian Ocean, including Australia, and extending into the South Pacific Ocean. About 18.5 million years ago, the spark of mind, the first distinctive attribute of soul, began to stir and to lift the Lemurians from the animal into the human kingdom. This spark lay more or less dormant for some time, and animal tendencies persisted, but the primitive desire and emotion that was emerging meant that humans were no longer satisfied with their animal existence. As Lemuria gradually sank due to excessive volcanic activity, some of the more advanced Lemurians fled to Shambhala at the directive of the higher beings who lived there, and with whom they had come into contact, whilst the rest of the survivors moved to surrounding land masses that would become part of Atlantis, such as India and Africa. The fourth root trace, the Atlantean, emerged from the Lemurian. Originating about 10 to 12 million years ago, it inhabited the fourth continent, Atlantis. The Atlantean civilization experienced a golden age between 1 million and 900,000 years ago. But when large numbers of Atlanteans became overly materialistic and began to use magic for selfish ends, its downfall began. The materialistic magicians were opposed by those who had not succumbed to their practices, but nevertheless, mainland Atlantis began to sink due to earthquake activity. A few large islands survived, which became sanctuaries for the more advanced groups so that the human evolutionary process could proceed, but the decline continued, and about 98,000 years ago, most of the remaining islands sank. The last one to sink was the small one, which Plato refers to as west of the Pillars of Gibraltar, and that sank into what is now the Atlantic Ocean around 10,000 BCE. When Atlantis began to sink, the Brotherhood at Shambhala warned their disciples to escape. Some of the survivors, as was the case when Lemuria was destroyed, found their way to Shambhala, whilst others fled to surrounding lands, the Americas, Africa, parts of Asia and Europe, to establish the present fifth root race. The seeds of the fifth root race, the Aryan race, began to emerge 7 to 8 million years ago in Atlantean times, and was becoming an identifiable race around 100,000 years ago. Around 80,000 years ago, a small group of Aryans left Atlantis. Some went to the Sahara, which was at that time a rich and fertile rainforest, and on the shores of an inland sea founded the City of the Sun. This would account for the populating of Africa with cultures resonant with each other and with their common source, Shambhala. These would include cultures as superficially diverse as those of ancient Egypt and the Dogon tribe of Mali. It is worth noting that this theory does not negate the general thrust of the out of Africa theory, as proposed by current mainstream academics such as paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer, although it does of course differ in much detail. Within the mainstream itself, there is disagreement about the timescales and the processes, and also with the theory itself, and Stringer has noted that the ongoing discovery of new data is continuously pushing back the dates of origin for modern humans. The fact that the East is also seen as a source of great cultural and spiritual influence in other parts of the world does not conflict with the out of Africa theory when we consider that the rest of the group that escaped from Atlantis travelled on to what is now the Gobi Desert, to an island called the White Island in the middle of what was then an inland sea. There, below the etheric city of Shambhala, they built the City of the Bridge. From there, the various sub-races, the Hindu, Arabian, Persian, Celtic, and the Teutonic, migrated to various parts of Eurasia between 60,000 and 20,000 BCE. According to Blavatsky, the sixth subrace of the Aryan root race, which would be called the Australo-American subrace, would begin to evolve in Australia and the United States in the early 21st century. The seventh root race would arise from the seventh subrace of the sixth root race on a future continent that would arise from the Pacific Ocean. These are immensely challenging propositions to take on board. Such an account of human evolution and the timescales, stages and processes involved, not to mention the existence of a group of super beings which has been here for the duration and is still somehow playing a role in the unfolding of planetary events, flies squarely in the face of all currently accepted scientific and historical theories. First of all, it completely contradicts the Darwinian theory that human beings have evolved from a common ancestor shared with the apes. Darwin was correct in identifying evolution as a fact for planetary life, and he did strike a grievous blow to the ridiculous propositions of the creationist model. But, as is widely acknowledged today in the mainstream scientific community, the theory is deeply flawed, not least because of the gaping holes in the fossil records. However fixated mainstream academics can be on their theories, a theory, however informed, remains just a theory. As such, Blavatsky's proposition that apes descended from acts of human bestiality, a process which was started when the separation of the sexes occurred in Lemurian times, when mental intelligence was still absent and primordial humans were wont to emulate the animals, is surely an equally viable theory. The fact that we share 96% of our DNA with chimpanzees could bolster either theory. The main problem with Darwinism, which has become the dominating paradigm in many other fields of intellectual inquiry, is that it posits an overwhelmingly linear view of evolution. The view suggested by theosophy, however, I use the term with a small rather than a capital T, could be described as spiralic, where a forward trajectory runs through cycles upon cycles of time. Take history, for example, where we find the pervasive assumption that human beings, living before the first historical civilizations appeared on the scene around 4000 BCE, were far less evolved than we are today. Given that humans first became the sexually separated species we know today, approximately 16.5 million years ago, however, the 6,000-year duration of our current civilization seems like a drop in the ocean, and several such civilizations could quite easily have been and gone in that time. Mainstream science maintains that our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, has been around for at least 100,000 to 200,000 years, and there is no evidence to say it doesn't go even further back than that. As such, in the interests of scientific research, our earliest origins must surely remain an open question. Lack of evidence does not constitute negative proof, merely lack of evidence. Given the remote times we are dealing with and the continental shifts that are constantly occurring, evidence may never be forthcoming of the type that would satisfy material science, although it has to be said that these days remains of human habitation are often being discovered under coastal seas which are within the age range of the historical record. What might be discovered in the middle of an ocean that goes even further back in time? Indeed, when it comes to the field of archaeology, there has been a serious disruption in the accepted timeline for the start date of human civilization with the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, possibly a temple complex in the 1990s. For most of the 20th century, academics were in general agreement that the first civilizations appeared on the historical stage between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. But at 12,000 years old, Göbekli Tepe has meant a serious revision of the accepted timeline. With its advanced construction skills and clear astronomical knowledge embedded in its structures, it pushes back the mainstream academic start date for human civilization much further than 3100 BCE. Although generally refuted by the mainstream, academics in this field being notoriously protective of their theories and the careers that depend upon them, theories have emerged in recent years that human civilization came even earlier than Göbekli Tepe. Even within the time span that we have been anatomically modern humans, there could have been more than one civilization on the planet. Our current civilization, which had a definite historical start, and by the look of things is about to have a definite end in the not too distant future, is likely to have a duration of 6,000 to 7,000 years. Even allowing for a long primitive period between civilizations, it is not difficult to calculate that there could have been at least one prior to the one that is now ending. It is generally thought that at the end of a civilization, leaving all traces buried under successive geological upheavals, it is the pre-literate tribal communities that survive rather than the inhabitants of the industrialized urban centers, together with a handful of enlightened survivors who could teach the ancient knowledge and the arts of civilization to the inhabitants of the incoming age. The fact that the civilizations of India, Sumer, and Egypt appeared out of nowhere, with advanced knowledge of, amongst other things, writing, mathematics, science, art, building techniques, and a fully formed, sophisticated mythology that embodies astronomical data that could have only been accumulated over millennia, strongly suggests that they had their roots in an earlier source. In fact, the first historical civilizations themselves bear witness to the fact that they were not the first civilizations to appear on the planet in their own accounts of their histories, replete with long king lists reaching back far into prehistory, and the myth of a golden age that was destroyed many eons before their era by a great flood. The idea that there could have been earlier civilizations than the present one is supported by independent researchers such as Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval, who have emerged to defy academia and capture the public imagination with a different and much older interpretation of history. What their research reveals, amongst other things, is that these long lines of priest kings guarded secret knowledge which was transmitted through myth for thousands of years and embedded in the art and architecture of the first civilizations and in certain monuments which almost certainly predate them. At the core of this mythology is a star religion with a particular reference to the precession of the equinoxes. Equipped with the precessional key, Hancock, Bauval and others have proposed a date for the end of the Golden Age, also known as Zep Tepi, or the first time, to the Egyptians, at approximately 10,500 BCE, which coincides with the date Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. While these researchers have fixed the end of the first time at 10,500 BCE, there are indications that the origins of human civilization could go much further back than that. Bauval proposed that the Giza pyramids are aligned with the three main stars of Orion's belt, Orion being a key player in the precessional cycle. But while they do fit with the formation of the belt, astronomically they do not perfectly align with 10,500 BCE, which leaves open the possibility that they could align with an earlier time. Blavatsky wrote that they were 35,000 years old, and indeed more recent research reveals evidence that the Great Pyramid may well have been submerged in water at some point, at the time of a great flood maybe, or when sea and land were distributed across the planet in a radically different way than they are today. Likewise, the Great Sphinx at Giza is a precessional symbol, a huge stone monument with a human head and a lion's body. The Sphinx embodies the transition from Virgo to Leo, the head being that of a female rather than that of the dynastic pharaoh Khufu or Cheops. It faces due east and would have been perfectly aligned precessionally with the constellation of Leo in 10,500 BCE. But then again, there is no reason why it could not have been facing Leo in an earlier turn of the precessional cycle. In support of Hancock and Bauval, geologist Robert Schoch has suggested that the distinct erosion marks covering the body of the Sphinx are due to rainwater rather than sand abrasion, which date it to a time when the region was much wetter than it is now, which, geologically speaking, could be no later than 10,500 BCE. More recently, however, Ukrainian geologist Vyacheslav Manichev and Alexander Parkhomenko have suggested that the erosion marks on the Sphinx were not caused by rainwater, as Schoch claims, but by long submersion in water when sea levels were much higher. This, geologically speaking, would make it a staggering 750,000 years old. But, as they also point out in their paper, this is roughly in agreement with Blavatsky's dating of the Sphinx at 850,000 years old. Manichev and Parkhomenko write in their article, "We have taken the great Egyptian Sphinx's age, such as it was indicated by theosophist Helena Blavatsky in one of her basic works. She wrote, 'Notice the indestructible witness of the evolution of the human races, from the divine through the androgynous races, the Egyptian Sphinx, that mystery of centuries.'" According to Blavatsky, the time of the great Egyptian Sphinx's erection should exceed 750,000 years. As ongoing discoveries in the fields of archaeology, geology, and paleoanthropology are made, and dating technologies are honed, the indications are that advanced civilizations, or at least human beings with advanced knowledge, may have run their course on this planet much earlier than mainstream dating allows for. The Darwinian view of evolution, with its relentless linear trajectory and the accompanying belief amongst modern humans that every aspect of life was less evolved in the past than it is today, is not that difficult to dismantle. In fact, the builders of the Giza monuments alone could defy the linear model. But when we consider human beings such as Plato, Buddha, Jesus, Shakespeare, the cathedral builders, the Lascaux cave artists, and a host of others, it is clear to see that there have been many in the past who far surpass the evolutionary attainment of most people living on the planet today. Herodotus refers to the wondrous dynasties of the gods that preceded the humans, followed by that of demigods, heroes, and finally by men. Today we consider ourselves to be living in an advanced civilization, the like of which the planet has never seen, and we consider it advanced almost exclusively on the basis of our technological achievements. And yet, how many of us who use the gadgetry of the 21st century, televisions, computers, cars, planes, and so on, could actually make it? Plato's Critias, citing the Egyptian priest in Sais, speaks about the fate of humanity in a cyclic universe. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story that even you, Greeks, have preserved, that once upon a time, Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. However far-fetched and challenging these timelines might be to mainstream academia, they do in fact find substantial support in the Kalachakra Tantra and its associated myths and scriptures, including the Judaeo-Christian Bible. Genesis, for example, which is a wholly mythical account, tells of 4 root races or epochs before our present race, the 5th root race. Adam is created a lone androgyne, which would place him in the Hyperborean period. When Eve is created from his body, this marks a separation into 2 distinct sexes, which occurred during the Lemurian period. Cain and Abel are Atlanteans. Cain is the materialist, magician, creating city-based civilization and all the corruption therein, while Abel and his replacement Seth are the spiritual magicians who remain in alignment with God's will. Noah, like the Hindu Manu, the Mesopotamian Utnapishtim, the Greek Deucalion, is the survivor of the great flood that destroys Atlantis, the ark embodying the sacred knowledge which needs to be carried through into the new age. He is the seed of our present Aryan race, which is established through a line of descendants that include Abraham, the father of historical Judaism. As for the first race, the description of the human being created at the beginning of Genesis could be interpreted as Polarian. Much has been made of the discrepancies and inconsistencies in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, where God creates 2 sexes simultaneously in chapter 1, but then creates the man, the Hyperborean androgyne, from which the 2 sexes emerge in chapter 2. Some have said this is because the 2 chapters are written by different writers. This might well be the case, but it could also be that chapter 1 describes the blueprint of creation, and the Polarian race was essentially a blueprint, and chapter 2 describes the process whereby the Hyperborean androgyne becomes the Lemurian couple. Support for this interpretation can be found in the way the days of creation are described in chapter 1, where there are 2 stages to the creation, and God said, being the idea stage, and it was so, being the manifestation stage. Again in chapter 2, we are told that there are as yet no plants or shrubs, because the right conditions for them to grow are not in place, which suggests that they already exist in potential, but not in fact. Since this seems to be the method of creation, then it is reasonable to assume that humans also came into being in this way. If this is the case, then it seems reasonable to suppose that between the blueprint stage and the fully manifested material entity, there would be an intermediate stage, such as the Polarian, as a vehicle for the human monad, which is breathed or emanated into him by God. All civilizations have a particular life pattern, namely a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our current civilization, which began before the start of recorded history, with Noah in fact, is now on its way out. Despite our so-called technological advancements, our lack of corresponding development in spiritual and ethical values means that rather than ascending an evolutionary arc, we are descending into materialism. This civilization may be on its way out, but with every ending there is always a group of survivors who endure the cataclysm to begin a new cycle and carry forth the sacred knowledge, the ageless wisdom, into a new cycle in the form of myth. The main obstacle to accepting the above description of human evolution as we gradually move into the 6th root race is the inability to perceive or intuit more subtle dimensions of reality than the purely physical, that we have ultimately emanated from an unmanifest archetypal reality, and that Shambhala is located on the border between the manifest and the unmanifest, can only be accepted and understood when we have acquired the appropriate level of spiritual vision and recognize that the evolutionary phase that we are currently entering requires us not to become even denser in our materiality, but to begin the return journey to our spiritual source.